This is a single subject research designs. So as the name suggests, in this type of quantitative research design, instead of studying groups, we are actually looking into individuals. So for critical questions in this module, we would like to highlight what are the essential characteristics of single subject research. Also, what are the different single subject designs? What are the different threats to its internal validity, along as the considerations to ensure that it is externally valid, meaning our conclusions are generalizable for that matter. Now, for the essential characteristics, as mentioned, this is a study that is actually pertaining about looking into an individual's change in behavior after being exposed to a particular treatment. Now, the whole point here is that this type of study is rooted on the discipline of special education, wherein oftentimes it is impossible for us to amass a number of subjects to conduct either a quasi-experiment or an experimental research study. So because of such limitation, instead of studying groups, and because it is not appropriate due to limited subjects, as well as the method of measurement is outweighed by observation, meaning mas maganda na observation ang isa sa gawin na metodo when we collect our data, hence the single subject research design. So for example, when you wish to study an intervention to students who are both deaf and blind, so it's very difficult to look for a case wherein an individual is deaf at the same time blind, and particularly if you are putting this into a level of teaching and learning process, and how the teaching and learning process in terms of the specific intervention would actually impact student performance, particularly those who are specially abled for that matter. The single subject research design is also an adaptation of the time series designs, but again, this is limited to analysis of one subject only at a time. So in other words, pwedeng mahaba ang obserbasyon na gagawin, pwedeng matagalan ang gagawing obserbasyon, pero ang focus natin, as I've mentioned, is only a single subject. Looks into the behavior. It looks into the changes of behavior of a particular individual after being exposed to a certain treatment. So, on the screen, you will see some of the notations or graphical representations on single subject research designs. So normally, we represent a symbol A for our baseline and a symbol B and C for our interventions. And here, in the baseline, you can see some data points of observations that are being conducted. So there were 4 observations. Then the unit of times, which is also properly intervaled. And then we would also have our results in terms of our intervention. So let's try to look at the specific variable here. So the dependent measure is frequency of correct responses. The independent variable, self-help instruction, some conditions identification, and so on. So let's look at some example of the designs. So here you would have a very simple A-B design. In other words, you did a baseline and then you did an intervention. So the conduct of the baseline is also necessary, and notice that it is taken at several intervals. It's not only one, no? At several intervals, to carefully record what the students are actually, or how the students are actually behaving in terms of behavior prior to the intervention. When the intervention was given, in this example, a praising students, for example, we look at the frequency of responses, and in this case there are several observations also that are made, and until such time that you are able to find a particular pattern. So if you notice, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 observations that were made, and in the 5 observations it was only in the 9th and the 10th that you can see that there seems to be a pattern already of response to the praise conditions. So this is an example of a very basic single subject research design in terms of baseline and intervention. So AB design. Now it is also possible that you can have baseline, praise, and then baseline again. So if you look at here, this is the ABA design. There was a mere observation prior to the praising condition, and then the praising condition was removed, and we look at whether there was a decline. So the purpose of this is to look at whether the student would actually go back to regress to original form if you remove the intervention. So this is a very interesting type of design as well. But of course, it doesn't stop here. If you are a researcher, then you would say, oh, so if I'm going to stop the praising condition, there is a tendency that after 3 observations, it will go back to the bottom. So if you look at this part here, this one, let me use the presenter. If you look at this part here, that is quite similar to this part. Okay, so it is possible that it will go back to this particular pattern later on. So as a researcher, if I am the researcher here, I would be introducing again the condition. Hence, you can look at the ABAB design. So here, after removing the praise condition, kasi nga bumalik sa baseline ulit, no? Bumaba ulit, no? Ang ginawa, binalik na naman yung intervention, yung praise conditions. And we're looking at it na umangat siya ulit. So in other words, you have identified a certain degree of reliability on how the students are actually responding to praise conditions, because in 2 treatment observations, you can see that the results are actually hitting similar tracks for that matter. So that was the baseline and then treatment series. But there are also other designs wherein instead of starting with a baseline, you begin immediately by recording observations on the basis of the interventions. So here, as you look at, there were interventions that were given immediately, then the baseline, then the intervention again. So medyo baliktad po siya ng konti, no? But then again, the pattern is still similar. Only that the beginning point or the entry point of the observation or the data gathering process was contrary to the previous series na nagsisimula sa baseline. So ngayon, nagsimula ka sa pag-record doon sa interaction ng bata sa behavior beginning with the treatment. So that is the BAB design. Then, in the same manner, you also have the ABCB design. What is the ABCB design? The ABCB design is a combination of a baseline. You begin with a baseline and then you introduce different types of intervention in this case. So firstly, the researcher started with a contingent praise. Tiningnan niya, inobserve niya, nag-increase. Now, binago niya ang pamamaraan ng praise, say non-contingent praise. There was a decrease, no? So this observed changes is this observed dip, no? Dip in observation is attributable to the type of intervention. Nung binalik niya to verify whether it is indeed related to this, binalik niya yung first na intervention na binigay, which is contingent praise, notice na nag-increase ito ulit. So ibig sabihin, this is showing us the utility of how single subject design could also be useful in identifying appropriateness of treatment. No? So this is a very good type of variation of the single subject design. Now, we can also consider a multiple baseline design. And in the context of multiple baseline design, what is notable here is, of course, the series of baseline studies that have been conducted. So behavior 1, Behavior 2, so maraming behavior ang binaseline. Okay? Then after that, there were treatments that were given. So, meaning sa isang bata, pwedeng maraming behavior ang i-record mo, and then you could also consider identifying treatment specific to such behavior. So, kahit isang bata lang yan, pwedeng maraming interventions ang binigay kasi pwedeng maraming target na behavior ang gusto mong gawin. But there is a risk there, of course, because you cannot now filter specifically or isolate specifically the results of the treatment. And speaking of problems or issues, there are issues that has to be considered, no? But before anything else, I would like to introduce some other designs. You have the ABA-CA design. So if you notice here, the intervention was consistently given in between, the baseline was consistently taken in between interventions. So there was a baseline, another intervention, a baseline ulit, then another set of intervention was introduced, and then a baseline ulit. Here naman, if you look at, the interventions were repeated. No? So baseline, intervention A, intervention B, binalik kay intervention A, then intervention B. The third alternate is that there was no baseline. It's more of like the intervention, then another type of intervention, and then binalik sa first na intervention na binigay. So in this case, it is a direct comparison of the intervention, and there was no baseline that has been conducted. And similar with this one. No? So variations niya na ito. So itong tatlong ito, hindi na niya ginamit yung baseline. Okay. Now, remember that the number of subject that is being studied here is only one. And so because it is only one, we have an issue of external validity. And what is that issue? You cannot generalize the findings. You cannot say that what you've observed from a particular single student would be true to other student. And so that you would be able to generalize, you can address issues of external validity by creating replication. So ulitin mo ulit sa ibang bata. At i-record mo, tingnan mo, in how many observations after 30 subjects, that 30 replications, you're able to show already that there was consistency. You record the data for that, then you would have 30 sets of data already, and that would be sufficient already for you to establish a statistical analysis to determine, of course, the extent of effects of these particular variables for that matter. So again, this is an issue in external validity kasi isa lang yung subject, but such issue could be circumvented, could be augmented by coming up with replications. Okay, so issues now of this design. The conditional length, or what do we mean by conditional length? Now, condition length refers to how long the baseline and interventions are in effect. So, the length of the baseline and the conditions. Kasi, minsan, nag-baseline ka ng isa, kung hanggang dito lang ang baseline mo, that is not sufficient because that particular baseline cannot establish a pattern yet. So, again, we have to be very clear. You look at your observation should resemble a pattern, no? Should resemble a pattern already. So ito, sa baseline na ito. So kung titingnan mo, andito yung bata talaga, no? Ito, maybe this is attributed to something. Okay? So again, the conditional length, no? The length refers to, or the condition length refers to how long the baseline and intervention conditions are in effect. So we have to have sufficient information. And what is the minimum baseline or treatment length? It has to be 3 for that matter. So that's the minimum length to consider. Now, another one or another threat to internal validity is the aspect of change of variables from one condition to another. So the number of variables change when moving from one condition to another. What do we mean by number of variables change? Now, you look at the illustration here. Yung isa library, yung isa general classroom. So, if you look at the situation ng dalawa, the condition line here, here is the condition line. Staggered siya kasi ito mas marami ang observation. 7. Ito, tingnan mo lang naman. 4. So, magkaiba yan. No? Magkaiba. When you change the condition from the general classroom setting to the library setting, so you have 2 different conditions here. So, again, this is a very important consideration. You have to take note that only one variable be changed at a time as you move from one condition to another. Kasi pag maraming variables ang i-change mo, then it's going to be problematic. So you only change one variable. Alright. Another threat is on the degree and speed of change. So, we have to factor into consideration the magnitude on the data change at the time of intervention. What do we mean by this? We have to take note that our baseline data is purposed to identify the stability of the information, the trend. And when you introduce the intervention, there is possibility that the subject's behavior may not change for a period of 3 sessions. So, because it did not change for a period of 3 sessions, like this one, there was no change in behavior. And we've said a while ago nga dapat at least 3, it is sometimes unnecessarily possible to increase, to add more observations for that matter, so that you would be certain that definitely there is a sustainability on this particular behavior. Kasi minsan, akala mo sustained na yung behavior, pero tingnan mo naman yan, that is a decline. So nung umpisa lang, parang immediate reaction lang, pero hindi siya talaga na sustained. So remember here is that the purpose of the treatment is to ensure na sustainable yung reaction, yung behavior ng bata, no? Baka sa umpisa lang, tapos yun naman pala nag-decrease ulit. So again, that is an issue that we have to consider to ensure na talagang may sustainability or mayroong the condition or the observation that attributed to the treatment is actually sustained. Now we have to establish that in the pattern. And then return to baseline level. What do we mean by return to baseline level? You look at the change of behavior. This is the baseline. This is the baseline. You did an intervention. When you did a baseline, anong nangyari? Ganun pa rin, no? Bumaba pa rin. You did a baseline, tas mas mababa pa yung intervention. Ang nangyayari pati, there is this worsening. No? There is this worsening. So, this indicator or this situation actually is telling us na something might have happened. Kasi ang purpose mo, dapat itong intervention na ito, mapaganda yung behavior. But if you look at, it worked the other way around. So, there is a certain threat, a degree of a certain variable that have caused this, no? So that is something that you have to look into kasi it did not work as intended. So pwedeng tingnan ulit yan. So that is a threat that you have to consider for that matter pag ganyan yung lumabas na result. Another threats also to internal validity is on independence of behavior. What do we mean by independence of behavior? So this particular type is very much applicable when the type of a single subject design that is being applied is actually on multiple baseline studies. So for that particular multiple baseline studies, you have to be very certain that the behavior that you are observing, kasi multiple baseline, no? Meaning there are different behaviors that you are doing a baseline observation. Careful tayo because posibleng we thought that they are independent behaviors but they are actually overlapping behaviors. So ang nangyayari, hindi mo na-filter masyado yung attributable pattern specific to the behavior. Kasi nga, yung behavior ay hindi independent to each other. So you have to make sure that this behavior that you are observing are mutually exclusive so that your observation would be specific to the behavior. Otherwise, it's gonna be problematic. No, it's gonna be problematic. Then the number of baselines. So, the number of baselines, as I've mentioned a while ago, should be at a minimum of 3. So, mas maganda kung mas marami pa. And the degree as to when to stop doing a baseline and when to stop doing an observation, even in treatments, is specifically when you can see that the pattern is already consistent and is sustained. So if the pattern is still erratic, then you have to continue observation because it means that hindi pa siya sustained, no? Or hindi pa fully adapted siguro yung bata to the intervention, and so that's the reason why there were variations pa. Now, single subject designs generally provides a means of control to the threats of internal validity, specifically on subject characteristics. Why is that so? Wala nang issue dito yung subject characteristics kasi isa lang naman yung bata na ino-observe mo. So there is no variation here. Of course, when you do replication, that is the time that you have to highlight what was the characteristics of the child. Yun yung gawin mong matching criteria sa paghahanap mo ng next subject wherein the treatment will be replicated. Mortality, well, unless yung isang subject mo nag-succumb dito, then basically this will be an issue, but oftentimes it does not happen kasi that is part also of the assessment. When you try to assess a child to be part of to be observed, isa yon sa tinitingnan, no? Yung likelihood on how capable the child to sustain the treatments so that yung mga interventions ay hindi naman masasayang. Testing, wala ding issue sa testing kasi isa lang ito. History and threats, well, hindi din ito maging masyadong issue because primarily there is only one that is being observed, and whatever that had happened during the conduct of the activity, that could easily be documented. So lahat ay makikita actually in the context of the observation. Single subject design though are less effective when it comes to controlling for threats of location, data collector statistics, maturation, and regression threats. So yung pinaka-issue dito ay yung regression threats. Nakita nyo kanina, nag-shoot down yung intervention at saka yung possible na nag-mature yung bata. So yung effect ng observation is attributed to maturation. Now yung location, data collector statistics are something that nagiging issue when you are doing replication. When you are doing replication. But for the matter of data collectors, this is not statistics. Data collector bias po ito. Bias. Nangyayari po ito when you are doing the replication part already. So, yun lang po yung issue dito. Pag nagre-replicate ka na, this location and data collector statistics or data collector bias may be an issue. Now, in general, the single subject design is threatened by instrumentation, data collector bias, attitudinal and implementation threats. So ito yung mga general threats niya na pwede mo makita. So that's why it's very important yung instrumentation mo, the standardization aspect is very important. How the data collector would bracket his own nuances in the observation, and if even possible, come up with rubrics in the observation to ensure that there is a degree of standardization and there would be no instrument decay for that matter. Attitudinal and implementation threats, kasi nga, of course, when you are doing a study for children who are specially able, it really requires a very good attitude from the researcher. Kasi naman, pag irate naman din sa researcher, baka hindi niya ma-withstand yung observation process, no? So, hindi niya masyadong mag-grasp or makikita yung dapat nakita kasi mas naunahan ng kanyang sariling attitude towards the conduct of the study. So, we have the vetting procedure. There will be multiple observers. The vetting procedure should be necessary for these observers kasi nga mahirap mag-standardize lalo na if it is an observation, and this requires the use of rubrics for that matter. So it's a summary on single subject design. So this is a discipline that is this is a study, or this is a type of research design whose discipline of origin is actually SPED. It is focused on observing single subject as opposed to an individual. The types of designs for single subject design is characterized by varying orders of multiples of baselines and interventions, B and C. And then the single subject designs provides a degree of control to some issues of internal validity, however challenge as well to other issues of internal validity. And then, ito kasing external validity ay napakalaking issue talaga nito, no? Because it has something to do with the very core characteristics of research. Is research replicable? Yun yung punto doon eh. Will you be able to produce similar results in consideration of similar subjects? So yung punto dyan ngayon ay dapat ma-ensure itong external validity. So some journal articles or some journal publishers, hindi nila masyadong tinatanggap kung isa lang yung subject, kung wala pang kasamang replication. So dapat mayroong degree of replication na nangyari for it to become publishable. But this is a very interesting tool na kung iisipin natin when we are doing action research in our classroom, talagang mayroong deviant dyan na bata. So kasi may deviant dyan na bata in terms of behavior, pwedeng i-intake procedure mo yung kanyang behavior at gumawa ka ng intervention at i-record mo ito. And that in itself is already an action research. So pwede mo siyang ipasok as an action research actually. Do not publish it as a single research subject. Though the design is single research subject, pero action research yung lens. Tapos, because action research naman is continuous then, when you encounter another student, maybe after a semester or a year, ganun din ang gagawin. You try to introduce the treatment and see if the findings that you've acquired to the previous student is consistent with the student now. So again, yun yung issue natin dito, the external validity, no? And we have to conduct replications for this to ensure that our findings will be consistent. Okay, so that actually ends my discussion.